Okay. You can't see you then.
Yeah,
That's all right.
Oh.
just a minute or so to go.
Minute or so to go.
Like the American progress.
Yeah. Well, I have to record it, otherwise I can't put it on YouTube.
That's very, very helpful, though.
Yeah, I could.
We'll let you, Martin.
Have you got access to yours? Want to do it?
No.
It makes you realise just how clever some people are, because it looks very homemade.
Okay, with angle. Who can you see it?
And it'll make everybody appreciate how clever and Judy is.
Oh, it's Judy. She does it all the technical stuff.
Martin.
You can hear the cackle in the background. Yeah.
If she has, she's been fibbing to me, Martin. Hiding a light under a bushel.
Everyone's her.
One of Judy's.
We're up to 45. Right, now then, why can't I get myself up to big screen? Oh, well.
Top right hand corner, view.
Yes. Speaker view?
Click on speaker view.
Yes.
That should bring you up when you speak. Should bring me up when I speak.
I'm speaking now, and I'm not sure that it has, but never mind. Shall I do gallery view?
Gallery view will give you everybody, which is always nice when people put their pictures up.
Isn't that strange? All right, speaker view is what I've got on now. Right, everybody, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. We're due to have another of these in a fortnight on the 5th of July. Oh, it's getting very hard with this. I'm annoyed about that. Why won't it go to big one? Right, I'm going to mute everybody except, excuse me, except us. So
Really, really wonderful, isn't it? Yeah, it's got such a value, this garden. It's more than just a garden, isn't it? It really is a special place for them now.
Now, you girls, normally you're absolutely chit-chat. You're
right, that's as good as I'm going to get it, I'm afraid. I've just changed chairs because Judy needs to be a higher one than mine, and we'll make a start. Thank you.
Maybe?
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're off.
Good morning, everybody. This is the second part of the campaign for the abolition of the slave trade and also the abolition of slavery itself. And I hope you'll agree that it is very current. Just a few days ago, there was something in the Times, I don't know how many of you saw it, and the heading is "Even Handel profited from the slave trade." And then it says, as we listen to Messiah, we should face up to the inconvenient truth that great art and great evil sometimes go together. And then the rest of the quite lengthy article is about people having money invested in what was called the sugar trade. But it was actually the slave trade, because the Caribbean islands, the sugar islands, were manned by slaves, by African imported slaves. So I think that this handle isn't the only one that is being kind of outed. It's happening as we speak. There are people investigating very eagerly important families, politicians from the past, to see if they have any connection with slavery. It's a kind of a very current issue. I'm just going to go through the pro-slave trade arguments. We've done them before, but just to recap. The Bible endorses slavery in Genesis. In case you're wondering how this could possibly be, the story of Noah's Ark, which left only a handful of people, and everyone else had been destroyed. Remembering, of course, this is a legend. One of the sons, Ham, was Ham, Shem, and Japheth, the three sons of Noah. Traditionally, Ham was black, and that's where the black race has come from. That's they're descended from Ham. Doesn't say that in the Bible, but that's a very ancient tradition, that's where the black people came from. They were descended from Ham. Ham had a son called Canaan, and he saw his father naked, the Bible says, and that was such a terrible thing that he was then punished by God, and the punishment was Canaan would become a servant or a slave to his brothers. And that's where this idea came from, that there is Bible authority for black people to be servants or slaves to white people. So the next point is African leaders were complicit. True. The slaves had a better life on the plantation than in Africa. You could argue that. You could say, well, they were fed, they had a home, they had probably a nicer home than perhaps a mud hut in Africa. But you couldn't really argue that it was better because of punishments, which we will come to. Given free accommodation, clothes and food, yes, they were working, but they were being, you could say, being rewarded. The work of the plantation was easy. That was debatable. The hours were incredibly long. Might have been easy work in itself. It certainly wasn't complicated in any way, but it was the hours were incredibly long. Very important, the myth of the happy slave, that they danced and they sang, and that proved that they were happy. They were told about Jesus, so obviously that was a good thing. It was arguably very good that they were being told about Christianity, whereas before they'd been thought, it was said, ignorant heathens with all sorts of weird and wonderful ideas. When they were interviewed, surprise, surprise, they said they were happy. And of course, we all know that if somebody's standing behind you with a whip or threatening you, you're going to say whatever is required. You're not going to be a free agent. You're not going to say what you really think. And then down to brass tacks, as we say in Yorkshire. The British economy would be severely damaged if the slave trade was made illegal. Many people would be financially ruined. They had invested very heavily in the slave trade. And the final argument, which is absolutely ironic, our belief in freedom in the British Isles, our love of liberty, people should be left to make money in whatever way they could. We were proud of our culture of individual freedoms. The government interference was therefore wrong. It was to be deplored, and that attitude continued right through into the 20th century. And we still talk about, or some people still talk about, a nanny state. They don't want government interference. People should be left alone, and that included trading in slaves. If that was the way they chose to make their money, then the government should keep out of it. They should have nothing to do with interfering in any way. And then there are these influential events which gradually swung people's opinions round to the idea that the slave trade was evil. So one was the Somerset ruling, 1772. A Caribbean slave called James Somerset escaped. Well, he had escaped. He found work in this country, and very sadly, he was then recognised by his previous owner. And the previous owner grabbed him and beat him up and hurt him so badly that he actually became blind in one eye. Because he said, this man is my property. I can do what I like to him. He's my slave. He says he's free, but he isn't. I never gave him his freedom. He is my slave. And I'm taking him back to the Caribbean. He belongs to me. There was a court case as a result of this. And Lord Mansfield famously upheld ex-slaves' right to remain in England as free men and argued that the violence shown towards him was unacceptable, that he was a human being. That, of course, was a debatable point. Some people said Africans were not total human beings and white people were. And then the infamous Zong Case. Zong is the name of a ship, slave ship, and a horrible case arose where the slave, the trader, the master of the slave ship, deliberately threw 133 slaves overboard to drown. He said they were running out of water, but it was proved later that they hadn't run out of water. He then claimed insurance money for loss of profit, that these slaves were valuable cargo. He had been forced to dispose of them, and therefore he was claiming that they were goods. And the insurance company said they wouldn't pay. And so he took his case to the High Court. And again, Lord Mansfield was still Lord High Justice and refused the claim and said a crime had taken place. And there was a lot of publicity about it. And the public realised for the first time, or probably for the first time, that this trade was going on and that there were sort of disgusting and horrible conditions on board the slave ships. And they'd not realised before. They hadn't realised there was sort of brutality involved. That had all been, well, not kept from them, but they just never realised. And the final sort of push in the right direction, 1789, the same year as the French Revolution, a very famous book, thank you, Martin, a very famous book was published by a freed slave and became a bestseller, Lauda Equiano. He'd been kidnapped when he was 11. He could remember very clearly the day, and he described it in great detail of what it was like on the slave ship and the brutality, etc. So this was a primary what called primary source. It was a witness account from the point of view of a slave. So it was incredibly important that he was literate. His English was excellent. His book became a bestseller. He became a celebrity. He had his portrait painted several times. He had all sorts of wonderful outfits to wear because he became a public speaker. People were falling over themselves to hear from an ex-slave's own mouth what it was like to be a slave and what it would be like to live in Africa. Because, of course, he was 11 when he was kidnapped. He could remember his earlier life. And his experiences not only made him famous, they absolutely advertised, if you like, what slavery was actually all about. From a slave's point of view, very important indeed, very significant. Raising what we now call raising awareness, making people understand. And he was feted, he became a VIP. Martin found some brilliant pictures, so I'm assuming you've
Turn that page over.
You've got your notes.
You missed.
And significant factors. So I was a bit naughty saying that the Methodists was so significant, not well, naughty saying it, but I said the Methodists were very important, which they were. And I forgot to mention, even more important, the Quakers. The Quakers were even more important than the Methodists in arguing that one human being cannot hold another human being as property. That they argued that the moral issue, that it was totally ethically wrong for one human being to own another human being, take all their rights away from them. That what we now call it kind of people arguing about human rights. So they didn't use that phrase then, but we're familiar with it. Church of England evangelicals, I think I probably didn't give them the credit. There was a group of people in the Church of England who were like a ginger group. It was a sort of breakaway group of people who felt that the Church of England had become very smug and self-satisfied, and they weren't delivering what was needed to working class people. That it had become a very middle class kind of organisation, very set in its ways. And so they formed this group of, well, we're familiar with the word evangelical. And so the Quakers and the Anglican evangelicals and the Wesleyans together formed a very powerful force for good, and they argued that the very concept of slavery was against the will of God and it was evil. There was also a growing pride during the 18th century in Great Britain's role as kind of the moral arbiter. We believed that we were better, we were superior, we were beginning to be rather arrogant, and that got more and more obvious during the 19th century, where we were sort of trotting around the world telling people how to behave because of our widespread empire. But it started really in the 18th century, the idea that we were on the moral high ground. We weren't a police state. We didn't have dreadful prisons. We didn't torture people. We had a democracy. We were way ahead of other countries in Europe. We were superior in every way. So then you could say, well, what about slavery? That doesn't seem to quite fit into these great ideals of freedom and liberty and human rights. Another argument, somewhat more down to earth, commercial, was that if we ceased to trade, then other countries would still continue to use slave labour. We would be undersold and undercut. Our sugar trade would collapse. And so this is an argument in favour of keeping slavery. What would happen to the economy if we ended slavery? The sugar trade would surely collapse. If we were having to pay people to do the work that was being done for nothing, then inevitably the countries that were maintaining slavery would take over and our economy would be very badly damaged. And the idea was that if we couldn't keep replenishing the slaves on the plantation, if we couldn't keep getting fresh slaves from Africa, the plantations couldn't keep going, because the death rate on plantations, which was also hushed up for this myth of the happy slave all dancing around and happy, the death rate was appalling. So the argument was that the number of slaves on a plantation it needed topping up every so often. They couldn't supply enough by births on the plantation, which of course eventually is what happened. It was argued that really wouldn't work. And so some people who were hesitating and saying, well, I'm not very happy about this slavery business, were then sharply reminded, think about the economy. So campaign gradually increased the number of people arguing against slavery, including some rich, very rich people like Josiah Wedgwood. And eventually there were enough people finding the slave trade abhorrent to influence the House of Commons. I mean, poor William Wilberforce, who was the leading light in all this, and he tends to get all the publicity, but he was by no means the only MP who wanted to end the slave trade. But it kept coming up as a private member's bill year after year and being voted out. And then eventually, for all the factors that we've mentioned, for all the reasons we've mentioned, and public opinion also coming into play, as people became better informed, the slave trade was eventually ended in 1807. But Wilberforce didn't give a great sigh of relief and say, well, I've achieved my objective, that's the end of my mission, I am now exhausted, which he was. He then decided that he was going to continue the struggle to free all slaves, that slavery itself was morally wrong, and that should be he would dedicate the rest of his life to ending slavery in our West Indian Caribbean islands, the Sugar Islands. We couldn't do much about slavery in other parts of the world, but we could do something about the slaves that we held in the Caribbean. I haven't mentioned the French Revolution. That was also key. There were two arguments. First of all, the French Revolution was sort of a wake-up call. The French were talking about liberty, freedom in every respect. But George III's government was terrified that if these revolutionary ideas came to this country and were accepted, it would lead to anarchy. It would lead, obviously, the overthrow of the monarchy and the aristocracy and the church, because that's exactly what happened in France. An enormous, it wasn't just a revolution, it wasn't just killing the king. We had done that, of course. We'd killed the king in 1649. It wasn't just getting rid of the royal family. It was a complete revolution of redistribution of land, attacking the church, setting up new forms of education. It was absolutely an earthquake. It was like an earthquake, a huge earthquake had taken place in France. So two results of that, the ideas of freedom were being discussed openly. Intelligent people were talking about freedom in all its aspects. What did it mean exactly? But they were also very frightened that revolution would come here and overturn the monarchy, etc., etc. And the March 1807, when the Act was passed, it was called "This Great and Righteous Measure Becomes Law." So then we need to turn to looking at life on the sugar plantations. What was life actually like for the slaves? Was it awful, or were people exaggerating how awful life was on the plantation? Yes, of course, they proved that the slave trade was evil and that strapping people, fastening people down on deck in chains and selling them in a market was wrong. But what about life on the sugar plantations? People could still be bought and sold. So, obviously the plantations varied according to the owner. Some were well and humanely organised, and others were absolutely appalling. One problem, of course, there was no system of inspection and regulation. And nowadays we're very used to both inspection and regulation. In many aspects of our lives now, people are coming from outside, certainly in teaching, Ofsted. people coming in from outside and checking various ways of looking at a school, how it's run, not just the lessons, but the ethos of the school, the organisation, etc. But in the 18th century, no, not. Very much seen as back to no government interference needed here. We do not like government interference. We certainly don't want to be inspected and regulated. The army was built on that, based on that, and the navy to some extent, but pretty much there wasn't any inspection and regulation in people's lives. So the buying and selling of people, of course, continued. The slave markets hadn't closed. And this was, again, a very ugly aspect of slavery. That children could be sold to other plantations. If a plantation owner fell on hard times economically, if he gambled, for example, then he would sell some of his slaves to make money. And he would separate partners. They weren't supposed to get married, so, or they called themselves husband and wife, but they weren't allowed to have a religious service. So, you know, a man could be sold away from his partner. Children were sold away from their families. It was entirely the choice and decision of the slave owner, not the family members. This is a very ugly aspect of plantation life. And slave women lived in constant fear that their children would just suddenly be, when they were old enough to be useful, depending on the economy, the economic situation in that particular plantation, that they would be taken off to the slave market and sold. And plantation owners had ways of keeping the slaves in order, because it was not true that they were happy. They weren't. Many of them were not happy. And they tried to escape, sometimes successfully, usually not successfully. Or they would work slowly, or sometimes they would try sabotaging the sugar or doing something to show that they still had some rights, they still had some individuality. And so there was very, very harsh discipline. And one of the main ways, of course, was threatening to sell disobedient slaves away from their families and away from that plantation, so they would have to start again in a different plantation, or even warning them that they were going to be sold to a very, very harsh owner, a new owner that would beat them regularly, and that kept many of the slaves in order. That kept them obedient. The threat, the constant fear that they could be sold away from that plantation to another one where they didn't know what the conditions would be like, but they feared that they would probably be worse. So why risk it? Another method, which was very successful, was divide and rule, which is a way of keeping order, an accepted way of keeping order. Divide and rule. So what they did was they promoted likely slaves. They worked out which ones they felt were more intelligent than the others, and promoted them to all sorts of positions. The easy way of describing them was house slaves as opposed to field slaves. And the house slaves were given privileges and trusted in many ways. They had all kinds of important jobs to do. For example, some of the women or the girls were trusted with the wife, the owner's wife, her beautiful clothes, her beautiful 18th century clothes, and her jewelry and her wigs, and they were trained to be personal assistants or personal servants and they were trusted with the jewellery, and they were trusted to look after these beautiful clothes, and they were very proud of this fact that they weren't the field slaves. They were very superior. So it deliberately created a kind of class system. And I think we see that, although it's American slavery, in Gone with the Wind, where Mammy and her daughter see themselves as superior to the people who are actually working in the cotton fields. So this was a good idea to make this division, create this division, so that the ones who've been promoted looked down on the ones who hadn't, and also sided with their white owners. They didn't want to lose their privileges. They were still slaves, but they were having a pretty easy time of it. They were living in the big house. They were living in this beautiful, stately home. And they were obviously having better food and so forth, and wearing nice clothes. And apart from the fact that they didn't have their freedom, it was a pretty reasonable life. So they would be on side. They would never cause any trouble, and they were used as spies. If there was any trouble brewing, any strikes or any rebellions bubbling away, they would find out and they would report. They would tell the white owners, because they had a lot to lose if there was a rebellion on the plantation. So they were used as informers, and that system worked very, very well, very successfully. And the final way, of course, was simple brutality, keeping people in order because the punishments were so dreadful. Remember, there was no inspection, there were no regulations. It was entirely up to the owner of the plantation to choose what kind of discipline, what kind of disciplinary measures he would use. The most obvious one was flogging, either with a whip or a stick or whatever lay to hand. But the most horrible beatings took place, horrible, horrible beatings. Sometimes slaves were beaten to death, and the other slaves were invited to come and watch. So a sort of simple lesson being shown to them, a visual lesson. So to look what will happen if you cause any trouble, if you step out of line. And some slaves were beaten for the smallest infringement, just doing one little thing wrong, or not stepping in, not standing in line properly, or taking more than their fair share of food when it was handed out. The smallest little infringements, they would come down on them like a ton of bricks, and they would order a beating, flogging. Another was hanging. There's a picture, Martin found a picture of this, famous picture of the girl being beaten while she'd been hung up, hanged up on she's hanging on a tree with manacles around her wrists, which of course would be very painful. It would sort of wrench her shoulders, and being beaten. Sometimes they just hung them up on a tree and left them there for days to starve, and then they would cut them down. And of course they wouldn't step out of line again, because that punishment was so awful. Iron muzzles and bridles were used. If they said something out of turn, then an iron mask was put on their head with a big iron shape that went into their mouth, onto their tongue, pressed their tongue down, and then it was snapped shut, so that they not only could they not speak, they could hardly breathe. And some died with that particular treatment. It was so savage. It was used in this country actually for scolding wives. It was called a scold's bridle. But of course in this country, the woman would be released after an hour or two. But in the West Indies, it was, they could be kept there for days. So he couldn't eat, of course. And he could hardly breathe. He could hardly swallow. It was a horrible, horrible punishment. He was sort of choking to death. In some plantations, they actually used amputation. They certainly used branding. They often branded them when they arrived as if they were cattle. But other kinds of branding, confinement without food, was quite common, and making them work when they were manacled, and piling chains on them and then making them work and flogging them if they couldn't work because of the manacle. I mean, that was just, again, torture, a form of torture. It was sadistic. A lot of the punishments were sadistic. They were by no means reasonable, even though we're thinking about the 18th century when the prisons in this country were fairly dreadful, and you know, we had public hangings. Torture wasn't allowed in this country. We're very proud of that fact. But you know, life was very harsh, and some historians have argued, well, you know, life was very difficult anyway, and life on a plantation was no different from life in this country. You know, it's all being exaggerated, but that isn't the case. The punishments on the plantation, many plantations, were way beyond what was reasonable and acceptable in the British Isles. And there were slave uprisings. The slaves, despite these dreadful punishments and despite the fear of what we've just described taking place, they were desperate to be free. It isn't true that they were happy and content and singing and dancing and accepting their role in life and the great scheme of things. They were desperate to be free. And some managed to escape in Jamaica and live in the mountains, and their descendants still live there. It was sort of accepted that there was no stroppy, there wasn't any point in bringing them back. They were just going to cause more trouble, and they weren't going to work very well on the plantation, so they sort of left them there. But one very important turning point in the battle for emancipation of the slaves was a massive slave uprising in Jamaica in 1831. The Sam Sharp Rebellion. 60,000 slaves, which does rather contradict the idea that they were all happy and laughing and dancing and singing and content on their plantations. 60,000 rose up against their white owners. It was put down, of course, after 11 days, although alarmingly, the slaves had managed to get hold of firearms. And that was really a bit of a wake-up call for the people who were so opposed to liberating the slaves, proper word, emancipation. A difficult situation following that uprising. It actually did put the fear of God into a lot of people. What would happen? What would have happened if it had been a successful uprising? Obviously, they would have killed the white owners. They would have spread their ideas to the other Caribbean islands. It gave people pause for thought, made people think very deep, very, very hard, for the first time in many cases, about slavery in our West Indian possessions, our islands, our sugar islands. Meanwhile, William Wilberforce, who was ailing, he'd never been particularly healthy, and he was ill, but amazingly, he managed to continue his campaign. I mean, this is just totally amazing. What a great man. That it would have been so easy for him to give up and say, well, I've fought the fight. I'm handing over to somebody else now to lead this campaign because I have health issues. And everybody would have understood. But he didn't. He didn't. He continued. Every year, there was a private member's bill in the House of Commons to try and gain emancipation of the West Indian slaves. And every year, the people with the financial interests, or the politicians who possibly have no financial interest, but we're talking about the situation from the national point of view, saying we can't possibly emancipate the slaves, the sugar trade would be damaged, and it's one of our most successful trading enterprises. You know, millions and millions of pounds are tied up in this, our rivals will take over. Do we want that to happen? And also an argument which was quite valid, the sugar trade, the taxes that these rich people pay, these plantation owners, they pay taxes. They're keeping the British Navy going. You know, they're paying for our defence system in this country. We haven't got much of an army. We relied on the Navy, and that was a very powerful argument. Very selfish argument, of course, but pretty powerful. You know, sugar is such an important part of our economy. We can't afford to be sentimental. And then all the arguments that we started off the talk, all the arguments, well, don't know what you're worrying about. Why don't you go to a plantation and see how content and how happy they are? Well, they couldn't argue that, really, after 1831. They couldn't keep saying, well, they're all happy and dancing, because, 60,000 slaves had proved that they weren't happy at all. So that argument began to ring be a bit hollow as an argument. It can be sort of shot to pieces, really, by the Sam Sharp uprising. So William Wilberforce and the other campaigners took heart after 1831. They felt that they were getting closer to their goal, and so they began to campaign with greater enthusiasm and the feeling that they were nearly there. Other escaped West Indian slaves, not just Equiano, added to the testimony of what it was like to be a slave. So people who had been blissfully ignorant, again, had their awareness raised. They couldn't say they didn't know. They couldn't claim ignorance anymore. They couldn't say, well, I don't know anything about life on a West Indian plantation, but I've heard it's fine. They couldn't say that anymore. Because there were people, black writers, actually saying, no, I can assure you it is not wonderful. And there were pictures being produced. There were photographs and pictures being produced. Sorry, not photographs, pictures, drawings being produced, which were having an effect. Another argument, which is not quite so high-minded, is that after the Napoleonic War ended in 1815, the sugar islands weren't actually as productive as they had been. A lot of the sugar plantations had absentee owners. The owners left the plantation in the care of overseers. And some of the overseers, they were the ones who were brutal. They were ignorant, brutal men, and not particularly good at organising a plantation. So some of the plantations weren't as productive and well run as they had been. And we were facing fierce opposition from plantations in Cuba, particularly Brazil, and Mauritius and the East. There was sugar coming in from various directions now. We certainly didn't have any kind of a monopoly. So there was an argument that we were trying to keep going, and the slave-run plantations in our Caribbean islands, they weren't working terribly well anyway. Now, this isn't usually mentioned because we want to, again, we like to be on the moral high ground. So the way I learned this at school was, what a wonderful thing, finally. What fine people we are. We released our slaves in the West Indian Islands because it was the right thing to do. But I mean, unfortunately, we're now a bit more cynical. We know a bit more. It wasn't just the work of Wilberforce and the campaigners, the abolitionists. It was also commercial and economic reasons. Finally, the 28th of August, 1833, there were enough members of Parliament to oppose continuing slavery in the islands. There were enough people that felt it was wrong, and it was finally abolished. And William IV, the king, signed, gave the royal assent. A rather mean act. It didn't come into force until the following year. It was done slowly and gradually. The first stage was children under 6 would no longer be slaves. Any child born after 1834 would not be a slave. And then 800,000 black slaves were released in the Caribbean, South Africa, and we had a small number in Canada. So wherever we'd had the black slaves, they were emancipated. Then, very controversially, the slave owners said, you are depriving us of our property. We demand compensation. And actually that had been built into the act. Compensation would be paid. Big arguments about how much the compensation should be, what was a reasonable amount. And it was finally sorted out, it was finally decided that £37 per slave would be paid to the slave owners, the plantation owners who used slaves. It was not enough. Slave owners are very indignant that that's all they got. And of course, the slaves themselves got nothing. They got nothing. They were freed. They were very excited. They were very disappointed when they realised they got to wait another year before they actually got their freedom, that it was going to be done in stages. And the other thing that they found difficult was that, so that it wasn't a tremendous shock to the sugar trade, so that it wouldn't decline immediately, the ex-slaves, although legally had their freedom, would have to work on the same plantation where they'd been slaves for 7 years, as they would be called or known as apprentices. But they had to stay on the same plantation. So a bit of a sting in the tail. So a lot of excitement and people rejoicing, but then it wasn't quite as wonderful as they'd expected it to be. 7 years apprenticeship. So what were the consequences of emancipation? The textbooks that I was brought up with didn't go into detail. They just said, you know, how wonderful we've done this wonderful thing, and other countries haven't. Other countries continued with their using slaves. Again, you know, how brilliant we are with our love and liberty. We've released our slaves, and everybody lived happily ever after. They didn't. The slave plantation owners were furious that they'd been undercompensated. And the slaves themselves were disappointed when they realised that they couldn't leave their plantation. And so we'll just have a look at the consequences of emancipation. What was it really like? Well, first of all, the apprenticeship scheme failed dismally and sugar production plunged dramatically. Why would the ex-slaves, why would they want to carry on working as much as they, you know, as well as they'd done before, or as productively as they'd done before? They weren't slaves anymore, so why should they? So there were go-slows and strikes, and people pretending they didn't know how to do things. So that was a bit of a, that was a financially and economically, commercially a disaster. The obvious thing for the released slaves was that they wanted to leave the island. They wanted to seek their fortunes elsewhere, but how could they? They hadn't got any money. They were paid minimal amounts now. They weren't slaves anymore. They were paid. They were a paid workforce, but they now, of course, they haven't kind of realised that they would have, they'd never had to buy their own food or pay rent. So it was rather a shock that they now had to buy food and pay, pardon me, pay rent for their accommodation and pay for their clothing, which had always been provided. So even the ones that had planned to leave and hoped to leave, although they didn't quite know where they were going to go. I mean, many of them totally ill-educated. They'd never known anything but life on the sugar plantation. Most stayed on their plantations even after the 7 years were up. And life as a free man or a free woman wasn't all that different from how it had been before. So a feeling of deep disappointment. But in some way, they felt cheated. They'd been so excited and felt so anticipated freedom as being something so wonderful. And then it wasn't. Jamaica came out of it badly because conditions there had been harsher than some of the other islands. The soil was exhausted. There'd been no training for growing any crops other than sugar, so a lot of the released slaves now had to grow their own food and they didn't know how to. And there was economic depression and poverty, and that's sadly a legacy which has continued. And more violence in Jamaica. Of course, Jamaica was where the uprising had taken place, the Sam Sharp uprising, with savage punishments as a result of that. So it left a feeling of bitterness, disillusionment, and all sorts of social issues in Jamaica. The former house slaves took over as a new elite. And so the class system in the West Indian Islands, and particularly Jamaica, profound. That the South slaves, many of whom had been educated and allowed to learn to read and write so they could keep family accounts and look after the books, etc., of course, looked down on what later became the working class. It was a very powerful, and I don't know whether it still exists, but I imagine so, a very powerful class system. And also, very sadly, I discovered this at university and was surprised, a colour system, the very black ex-slaves were despised by the ones who had been the result of a relationship between the white owner, or white owner's son, and a black woman. They what we now call mixed race and paler skinned results of these liaisons, again, looked down on the very black African looking ex-slaves. And I found that out at university and was very shocked to think there was almost like a colour bar when in an island where I thought everybody was black and everybody was sort of equal, and discovered that that was not the case at all. I had a very, very good African Caribbean friend, well, West Indian. I mean, she was from Spanish Town in Jamaica, and she explained in all kinds of, it was fascinating that in all kinds of detail what it was like to be a Jamaican in the 1950s. She was from the educated classes, and she admitted that she did look down on the people who weren't educated and the ones who were very dark skinned, and I was absolutely shocked. I can't, even now I'm really shocked by what she was saying. So what we've got now is, I mean, the current thing is now to investigate people from the past who ended up being very successful traders and all had a business. Investigate, where did they get the money from? Where did they get their capital from? Were they involved in slavery? Were they involved in the trade? Were they involved in owning shares in a plantation? And as I said, this article about Handel, it says, when you next listen to Messiah or allow the pardon me, the joyful sounds of water music to wash over you, here is a fact to ponder that may make the experience a little less comfortable, if no less pleasurable. George Frederick Handel was involved in the slave trade. not just peripherally or through his patrons, not just as part of a society that profited widely from slavery, but financially and up to his intensely musical ears. Historians have recently discovered that Handel invested in the Royal African Company, one of Britain's two official slave trading enterprises. The National Archives at Kew hold a set of the company's stock transfers for 1720, signed by the composer, purchase and sale orders for human beings. 1/3 of the board of the Royal Academy of Music, a short-lived opera company, not to be confused with the Conservatoire founded in 1822, whose orchestra was led by Handel, were invested in the Royal African Company, which shipped more Africans into bondage than any other company in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. And so on, and so on. So in some ways, Handel's links to the slave trade are unsurprising. He was a comparatively wealthy man with an annual income of £600 a year, worth about £70,000 today, from the Royal Treasury, in addition to his earnings from the Royal Academy as master of the orchestra with a salary. The composer was not a greedy man. All the profits from Messiah were donated to charity. The slave trade was seen as a good investment and condoned throughout Europe by intellectuals, politicians, and churchmen. Many from the crown down, meaning the royal family, invested heavily. Robert Walpole, the United Kingdom's first Prime Minister, made about £9,000, over 1 million in today's money, by investing in the Royal African and South Sea companies, and so on and so on. So it is very current, which is why I thought we would benefit really from learning more about it. And you know, as we speak, people are researching, looking into stately home archives and investigating this embarrassing blast from the past. And you call it digging the dirt in a way, but the other way of looking at it, it's historically fascinating. Many people are feeling very embarrassed about it. Many stately homeowners or descendants of rich families are feeling very uncomfortable. But they need to remember that we're looking back to a time when many things were condoned, cruelty to animals, and you know, well, not bear baiting, but cockfighting and bare knuckle boxing, public hangings, all sorts of things. Stocks, people being allowed to throw things at people they disapproved of. Sometimes they ended up blind. People threw sharp things they weren't supposed to, but they did. You know, we can't judge the past in the same way as we judge the present. And there's a danger, I'm sure you agree, that we're going a little bit too far in finding fault with the past and people of the past, and then blaming people who live now because their ancestors did something that we now disapprove of and find deeply unpleasant. And so people are now blaming the descendants of slave traders and plantation owners in a very inappropriate way. But we do need to remember the valiant people like William Wilberforce, who fought the fight and dedicated his whole life to the ending of slavery. As you know, the Church of England is currently removing memorials, that was in the paper last week, from St. Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey. And I've ended this by saying nothing done in the 21st century can make amends for hundreds of years of exploitation of Black Africans by white Europeans. And certainly we shouldn't be standing on the moral high ground. We should acknowledge faults of the past, but not blame people who live now. just to end with these wonderful quotations from made by William Wilberforce, statements he made, and Martin's found this, if you've got your notes, this chain, which would be so appropriate as a frame for these great quotations. I love this one. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. The second one, if to be feelingly alive to the sufferings of my fellow creatures is to be a fanatic, I am one of the most incurable fanatics ever permitted to be at large. And great indeed are our opportunities. Great also is our responsibility. So we'll end the topic there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. I get these notes first to prepare, so then I hear Judy present it, and it really does blow your mind, I find. I mean, the last paragraph on the notes, which Judy just circulated for you. I mean, William Wilberforce didn't just get involved in the abolition of slavery. Factory conditions, cruelty to animals, Sabbath day observance, an endless list of good causes that he was promoting. Thank you, Judy. That was fascinating as usual. We'll be doing another Zoom meeting in a fortnight, and I will circulate the notes the weekend before if I get them. And I hope that you enjoyed this morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin.
Bye.
Take care all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great
Bye-bye.
session. Bye now.
Bye. Take care.
Martin, don't forget to stop the recording.
Thank you.